At his peak, he was worth $34 billion. He was the eighth richest man on the entire planet. Richer than Elon Musk was at the time. Richer than most European royalty. A Brazilian man from a country where 40 million people lived in poverty, who had built an empire so vast that international magazines called him the tropical Rockefeller. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is that none of it was real. The oil fields that were supposed to hold billions of barrels, mostly empty. The iron ore mines that were supposed to feed Chinese steel mills for decades, massively overvalued. The shipyards, the ports, the power plants, the entire industrial empire that made Wall Street fall in love with Brazil, built on projections that never materialized, debt that could never be repaid, and a story so compelling that some of the most sophisticated investors in the world handed over billions without asking the most basic questions. And the craziest part of all, when it collapsed, when $34 billion in personal wealth evaporated in less than 2 years, when his companies defaulted on billions in debt, and tens of thousands of ordinary Brazilians lost their jobs and their savings, Eike Batista did not go quietly. He did not flee. He did not hide. He gave interviews. He blamed the government. He blamed the market. He blamed everyone except the man who had spent a decade making promises he could never keep. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how one man convinced the world he was building the future of Brazil, lost more money faster than any individual in recorded history, and somehow walked away with enough left to keep fighting in courtrooms to this day. This is the story of the biggest boom and bust in Latin American history. To understand Eike Batista, you need to understand Brazil in the early 2000s. The country was experiencing something genuinely extraordinary. After decades of hyperinflation, military dictatorship, and economic instability, Brazil was finally growing. The commodity boom was flooding the country with money from Chinese demand for iron ore and oil. President Lula, a former factory worker who had grown up in poverty, was overseeing an economy that was lifting tens of millions out of destitution. Brazil was being called the country of the future, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the future might actually arrive. Into this moment of national optimism walked Eike Batista. He was not a self-made man in the traditional sense. His father, Eliezer Batista, had been one of Brazil's most powerful mining executives, the man who transformed Vale into one of the largest mining companies in the world. Eike had grown up with access and connections that most Brazilians could not imagine. He had studied in Germany, traded gold in Africa, and developed an instinct for identifying natural resource opportunities in a country that was bursting with them. By the 1990s, Eike had made his first fortune in gold mining in the Amazon. He was charismatic, photogenic, obsessed with speed and competition. He raced powerboats. He collected trophies. He understood that in Brazil, where personality and connections mattered as much as fundamentals, the story you told about yourself was as important as the reality beneath it. And Eike Batista was an extraordinary storyteller. The genius of his business model, if you could call it that, was its simplicity. He would identify a natural resource opportunity in Brazil, create a company around it, list that company on the stock exchange before it had proven reserves or revenue, use the stock market valuation to borrow money, use that money to develop the resource, and then use the developed resource to justify an even higher valuation. It was a pyramid of promises, each layer resting on the one below, all of them resting ultimately on the assumption that the resources were as valuable as Eike claimed. His first major success with this model was MMX, a mining company focused on iron ore in the state of Minas Gerais. MMX went public in 2006, and its shares rose dramatically as iron ore prices surged on Chinese demand. Eike sold his stake at exactly the right moment, pocketing billions and establishing his reputation as someone who could identify and monetize Brazilian natural resources better than anyone alive. Flush with cash and credibility, Eike went bigger, much bigger. In 2007, he founded OGX, an oil exploration company, and took it public in what was at the time the largest IPO in Brazilian history, raising $4 billion. OGX had no oil production. It had exploration licenses in offshore Brazilian waters, and a set of projections prepared by consultants suggesting those waters might contain billions of barrels of recoverable oil. might, suggesting project. But Eike sold it as certainty. In interviews, in presentations, in magazine profiles, he spoke about OGX's reserves not as possibilities, but as inevitabilities. He put his own credibility, his own track record, his own extraordinary personality behind the numbers, and investors believed him. Brazilian pension funds bought OGX shares. American hedge funds bought OGX shares. European institutional investors bought OGX shares. The stock rose and rose and rose. At the peak of OGX's valuation, Eike's personal stake was worth over $30 billion. Forbes put him on their global billionaire list as the 8th richest person in the world. Brazilian newspapers ran cover stories about the man who was finally going to make Brazil a global economic superpower. He was photographed with presidents and celebrities and royalty. He gave TED-style talks about entrepreneurship and vision. He seemed to embody everything Brazil wanted to believe about itself. He also founded OSX, a shipbuilding company to build vessels for OGX, and LLX, a port company to handle OGX's oil exports, and MPX, an energy company, and IMX, a sports and entertainment company. The EBX Group, as his conglomerate was called, was presented as a fully integrated industrial ecosystem, where each piece reinforced the others. In reality, each piece was deeply dependent on OGX producing the oil it had promised. And OGX was not producing the oil it had promised. The problems began emerging quietly in 2012. OGX announced that its first major offshore field, the Tubarão Azul field, was producing far less oil than projected. The geological formations were more complex than anticipated. Recovery rates were lower. The billions of barrels that had been promised were turning out to be hundreds of thousands of barrels, not billions, hundreds of thousands. Eike responded the way he always had, with confidence, with projections, with promises about other fields that would deliver what Tubarão Azul had not. He bought back OGX shares with his own money, a signal to the market that he believed in the company. He gave interviews insisting the fundamentals remained strong. He maintained the performance of certainty even as the reality beneath it was collapsing. But the numbers were unforgiving. OGX was burning through cash at an extraordinary rate. The other companies in the EBX Group, OSX and LLX and MPX, were all dependent on OGX succeeding. As OGX's production numbers disappointed quarter after quarter, the entire ecosystem began to shake. Creditors who had lent billions against the value of EBX assets began to get nervous. The stock prices of every EBX company began to fall. In 2013, OGX did something that shocked Brazilian financial markets more than any single corporate event in decades. It issued what became known as the put option notice. Deep in the terms of OGX's bond agreements was a clause that allowed the company, under certain conditions, to simply walk away from its obligation to buy back bonds it had issued. OGX exercised that clause. It was, in plain language, a default notice dressed in legal language. The company was telling its creditors that it could not pay them back. The collapse was immediate and total. OGX's stock fell 90% in a single day. OSX collapsed, LLX collapsed, MPX collapsed. The entire EBX empire, which had been worth $60 billion at its peak, was essentially worthless within months. Eike Batista's personal fortune, which Forbes had valued at $34 billion, fell to essentially zero. He sold his mansion in Rio de Janeiro. He sold his cars. He sold his art. He reportedly owed more than he owned. The human cost was devastating. Tens of thousands of workers employed across the EBX Group lost their jobs. Brazilian pension funds that had invested in EBX companies lost billions of reais of ordinary Brazilians' retirement savings. International investors who had believed the story lost billions more. The collapse contributed to a broader loss of confidence in Brazilian markets that would take years to recover. Brazilian authorities began investigating almost immediately. The questions were serious. Had Eike known that OGX's reserves were overvalued when he made his public statements? Had he misled investors deliberately to maintain stock prices while selling his own shares? Had he engaged in insider trading, selling shares based on negative information that had not yet been disclosed to the market? The investigations took years. In 2017, Eike Batista was arrested in Brazil on charges of paying bribes to the former governor of Rio de Janeiro, Sergio Cabral, in exchange for contracts and favors for his companies. The bribery allegations were connected to Brazil's massive Operation Car Wash investigation, which had uncovered systematic corruption across Brazilian government and business. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison for corruption and money laundering. It was one of the heaviest sentences handed down in the entire car wash operation. But Eike Batista has never spent a single day in a regular prison cell. Through a combination of appeals, legal maneuvers, health claims, and the extraordinary complexity of the Brazilian judicial system, he has managed to remain either under house arrest or in minimum security arrangements throughout his legal battle. Each conviction has been appealed. Each sentence has been challenged. Each attempt to make him serve real prison time has been met with another legal argument, another constitutional question, another delay. As of today, Eike Batista continues to fight his convictions from positions of relative comfort, while the Brazilian workers who lost their jobs, the pension funds that lost their savings, and the creditors who lost their billions have received almost nothing in compensation. The story of Eike Batista is not simply the story of a fraud. It is more complicated and more interesting than that. Some people who worked with him believe he genuinely thought the oil was there, that he was a promoter who believed his own promotions, a storyteller who had convinced himself his stories were true. Others believe he knew exactly what he was doing and calculated that the game could continue long enough for him to extract his fortune before reality arrived. What is not in dispute is the outcome. $34 billion in personal wealth built on projections that never materialized. $60 billion in total enterprise value evaporated in months. Billions in losses for pension funds, banks, and investors across Brazil and the world. Tens of thousands of jobs destroyed. And the man at the center of it all, still fighting, still arguing, still performing the confidence that made him famous, just now in courtrooms instead of magazine covers. The tropical Rockefeller, the man who was going to make Brazil great. The 8th richest person in the world. All of it built on the most expensive story ever told in Latin American history. If you believe the public deserves to know where the money actually goes, subscribe. Every week, we cover the frauds, the scandals, and the financial crimes the system would rather you forget.